October 27, 1942, 0647 hours. El Alamein, North Africa. The air tasted of cordite and diesel. Captain John Freeman pressed his goggles tight against his face as the Hawker Hurricane's Merlin engine roared beneath him, shaking every rivet in the fuselage. Below, through the morning haze that hung over the western desert like a filthy curtain, he could see them a column of German panzer tanks, 23 in total, crawling like iron beetles across the sand toward British lines. His hands were slick with sweat inside his leather gloves. The thermometer in the cockpit read 41 degrees Celsius, even at 8,000 feet. But it wasn't the heat that made his heart hammer against his ribs like a prisoner trying to escape. It was what he was about to do. Squadron Leader Harris's voice crackled through the radio, distorted by static. "Freeman, break off. I repeat, break off. Those tanks have flak coverage. You'll never make it through." John didn't respond. He couldn't. His throat had gone dry as the desert below. Every pilot in the RAF knew the statistics. Attacking armoured columns head-on, especially Rommel's panzers with their coordinated anti-aircraft guns, had a survival rate of 6%. 6%. 94 out of every 100 pilots who tried it never came home. But John Freeman wasn't thinking about statistics anymore. He was thinking about yesterday. About the makeshift field hospital 12 miles behind the lines, where he'd watched a 19-year-old corporal die on a stretcher, his legs gone below the knees, torn apart by a German tank shell. The boy had looked up at him with eyes that couldn't quite focus and whispered, "Did we stop them, sir? Did we stop the tanks?" John had lied. He'd said yes. Now, staring down at the real answer at 23 panzers rolling unstoppable toward the men who trusted him, who believed the RAF would protect them, John Freeman made a decision that every regulation, every training manual, every survival instinct in his body screamed against. He pushed the control stick forward and dove. The Hurricane's nose dropped like a stone. The altimeter needle spun counterclockwise 7,500 feet, 7,000, 6,500. The wind screamed past the canopy. His vision tunneled. And somewhere behind him, through the radio static, he heard Harris shouting something that might have been, "You madman," or might have been a prayer. What happened in the next 11 minutes would be called suicide by some, genius by others. But for John Freeman, strapped into a diving metal coffin with 4 20mm cannons and 8 rockets, it was simply the only thing left to do. But to understand why a 26-year-old pilot would throw himself into an attack that military doctrine called mathematically impossible to survive, you have to go back. Back before the war. Back before the uniform. Back to a place where the sky meant freedom, not death. John Freeman was born in 1,916 inches, a village called Ashford, Kent, a cluster of stone cottages and sheep farms where nothing much happened except the changing of seasons. His father, Thomas Freeman, was a railway engineer, the kind of man who could fix anything mechanical with a wrench and intuition. His mother, Eleanor, taught at the village school and played piano at church on Sundays. John was the middle child of 3. His older brother, William, was serious and dutiful, destined to inherit their father's trade. His younger sister, Margaret, was the clever one, always with her nose in a book. But John? John was the dreamer. He was 8 years old the first time he saw an airplane. It was 1924, a barnstorming biplane that landed in a farmer's field outside the village. The pilot, a former RFC flyer named Captain Pembroke, was offering rides for 2 shillings. John's father called it a waste of good money on a death trap. But his mother Eleanor saw the hunger in her son's eyes. She gave him the coins from her sewing jar. John Freeman never forgot that day. The moment the wheels left the earth and the patchwork fields of Kent spread out beneath him like a green and gold quilt. The way the clouds weren't just distant white things anymore, but cathedrals you could fly through. The wind in his face, the engine's roar, the feeling that gravity was just a suggestion you could politely decline. He knew, right then, what he wanted to be. His father didn't understand. "Flying's not a proper job," Thomas would say, tightening a bolt on some locomotive part. "It's circus tricks." But John was stubborn. At 16, he lied about his age and joined the RAF Volunteer Reserve. At 18, he was accepted into flight training at RAF Cranwell. His mother cried the day he left. She held him on the platform of Ashford Station, her hands gripping his shoulders, and said, "Promise me, you'll be careful up there." He promised. It was the last promise he ever made that he knew he couldn't keep. Training was brutal. Of the 42 cadets who started with him, only 19 graduated. John watched friends crash on landing approaches, others wash out after failing navigation tests, but he never faltered. Flying, for him, wasn't something you learned, it was something you remembered, as if his soul had always belonged in the sky and his body was just catching up. By 1939, when Hitler invaded Poland and Britain declared war, Flight Lieutenant John Freeman was stationed with 73 Squadron flying Hawker Hurricanes. He was 23 years old. He'd logged 847 hours in the air. He'd never fired his guns in anger. That would change very quickly. The Battle of Britain came like a hurricane. Summer of 1,940 German bombers darkening the skies over London, Spitfires and Hurricanes scrambling 4, 5, 6 times a day. John shot down his first enemy plane on August 15th, a Heinkel, He-111 over the Thames estuary. He remembered the moment the bomber's engine caught fire, the way it spiraled down trailing black smoke. He'd expected to feel triumph. Instead, he felt sick. Because inside that burning plane were men like him. Maybe one of them had a mother who played piano. Maybe one of them had lied about his age to join up. Maybe one of them had promised to be careful. But war doesn't care about maybes. John survived the Battle of Britain. Many didn't. His best friend, Flight Officer Peter Daniels, dead, shot down over Sussex. His squadron leader dead, killed when his Hurricane exploded during a bombing run. The cheerful Scotsman who flew on his wing dead crashed into the channel after taking flak. By 1942, John Freeman had been in combat for 3 years. He had 11 confirmed kills. He had the Distinguished Flying Cross pinned to his chest. And he had nightmares every single night. Dreams where he was burning, falling, drowning. Dreams where he couldn't save anyone. Then they sent him to North Africa. The Western Desert was hell with sand instead of fire. John arrived at RAF Gambert in June 1942, assigned to 6 squadron flying ground attack missions against Rommel's Afrika Korps. The heat was unbearable, 120 degrees in the shade. If you could find shade, scorpions in your boots. Flies that settled on your food the moment you lifted a fork, sandstorms that turned day into night and stripped paint off aircraft. But the worst part wasn't the desert, it was watching what the war was doing to everyone. The infantry called them the poor bloody infantry. British and Commonwealth troops holding a line that stretched from the Mediterranean to the Qattara Depression. They lived in slit trenches, ate bully beef from tins, and waited for German tanks to roll over them. When John flew low enough, he could see their faces gaunt, sunburned, haunted. He saw what the panzers did to them. He saw the aftermath of tank attacks, trenches collapsed, bodies torn apart, equipment crushed to scrap. Once, he circled over a destroyed medical convoy. The red crosses on the tents were still visible through the smoke. The Geneva Convention was supposed to protect medics. It didn't. John's squadron was ordered to hit German armour whenever possible. But whenever possible was a cruel joke. Tanks were nearly impossible to destroy from the air. The Hawker Hurricane was designed as a fighter, not a ground attack platform. Its machine guns couldn't penetrate panzer armour. You needed to hit a tank precisely from above through the thinner top plating while flying at 300 miles per hour and dodging anti-aircraft fire. The mathematics were simple and brutal. For every 10 sorties against German armour, 7 pilots didn't come back. The flak was too thick, the margin for error too slim. John watched his new squadron mates disappear one by one. Flight Lieutenant Davies shot down attacking a panzer column near Tobruk. Pilot Officer Thompson killed when his Hurricane took a direct hit from a 20mm flak gun. Sergeant Harris crashed after his engine was hit, burned to death in the wreckage. Each loss ate away at him. each funeral where they folded the Union Jack and played The Last Post on a scratched bugle, each empty bunk. Each personal effect sent home in a box, a watch, a photograph, a letter that would never be finished. By October, the squadron was down to 8 operational aircraft and 12 pilots. They were exhausted, stretched beyond breaking. And Rommel was pushing east, toward El Alamein, toward Cairo, toward the Suez Canal. If the Germans broke through, the entire Middle East would fall. General Montgomery launched the Second Battle of El Alamein on October 23, 1942. A massive offensive 195,000 Allied troops against 116,000 Axis forces. The plan was simple. Break Rommel's line, destroy his armour, push him back. But Rommel was a genius. He positioned his panzer divisions in depth layers of armour that could counterattack any breakthrough, and his tanks were superior. The Panzer IV, with its long-barreled 75mm gun, could destroy British tanks from beyond their effective range. British infantry called them Tigers, even though the real Tigers hadn't arrived yet. The name stuck because the fear was real. On the morning of October 26th, John's squadron received intelligence. A German armoured column, 23 tanks, was moving toward a weak point in the British line. A single understrength infantry brigade was all that stood between them and a breakthrough. The order came down: stop them. Squadron leader Harris gathered the pilots in the operations tent. He spread a map across the table, marked with red circles the German position. He didn't sugarcoat it. This is a suicide run, gentlemen. Those tanks have mobile flak guns. We go in low, we'll be torn to pieces. We go in high, we can't hit anything. Command wants us to try anyway. Silence. The kind of silence that presses on your ears. Finally, Pilot Officer Jenkins, barely 20 years old, still had acne, raised his hand. "Sir, what if we don't go? What if we refuse?" Harris looked at him for a long moment. "Then 2,000 men die in their trenches, and their blood is on our hands." Jenkins sat down. John stared at the map. Red circles, blue squares representing British positions, little symbols that represented thousands of lives. He thought about the boy who died asking if they stopped the tanks. He thought about his mother, back in Kent, who probably still believed he was being careful. He thought about every nightmare where he was falling, burning, drowning, and he thought, there has to be a way. "Sir," John said, "what if we don't attack horizontally?" Harris frowned. "What?" "Every attack doctrine assumes we come in level strafing runs, rocket attacks from a shallow dive. That's why the flak gets us. We're flying through their kill zone for too long." John traced a line on the map with his finger straight down. "What if we dive vertically? Nearly vertical, like a Stuka, but faster?" The tent went quiet. "Freeman," Harris said slowly, "that's insane. A Hurricane's not designed for dive bombing. The wings could tear off, the engine could stall, you'd black out from the G-forces pulling out." "Maybe," John said, "or maybe we'd be moving so fast the flak can't track us. Maybe we'd have enough kinetic energy to punch rockets through the top armour. Maybe 6% survival becomes 60%. Or maybe 0%, another pilot muttered. John looked at him. "We're already at 6%. What's the difference?" Harris studied the map, studied John. Finally, he nodded. "If you want to try it, I won't stop you, but I'm not ordering anyone else to follow." John stood. "I don't need anyone to follow. I just need a Hurricane, full rockets, and a target." Harris sighed. It was the sigh of a man sending another boy to die. "Your Hurricane's being fueled now. Target coordinates are here." He tapped the map. "Freeman. If this works..." "It'll work," John said. But his hands were shaking. But what no one knew, what John himself didn't fully understand, was what would happen next. October 27th, 1942. 0630 hours. John stood beside his Hurricane on the makeshift airstrip, a stretch of packed sand marked with fuel drums. The ground crew had loaded 8 RP-3 rockets under the wings, 60-pound high-explosive warheads that could theoretically penetrate tank armour. Theoretically, his crew chief, a Scottish sergeant named MacLeod, handed him his helmet. "You're really doing this, sir?" John took the helmet. "What's this, Mac?" "Whatever bloody stupid thing you told the squadron leader." MacLeod shook his head. "I've been with this squadron 2 years. I've seen brave men. I've seen crazy men. You're about to become both." John climbed onto the wing. The Hurricane's metal skin was already hot from the desert Sunday. He lowered himself into the cockpit, a cramped space that smelled of oil and sweat and fear. The seat had a dent moulded to the shape of his body after months of flying. It felt like home. Or a coffin. He ran through the checklist. Fuel, full. Oil pressure, normal. Magnetos, check. Guns, armed. Rockets, armed. His hands moved automatically, but his mind was racing. He calculated angles, speeds, distances. A vertical dive meant approaching at 90 degrees straight down. Terminal velocity for a Hurricane was around 470 miles per hour. The flat guns would have maybe 2 seconds to track him. 2 seconds versus the usual 8 or 10. But pulling out of a dive that steep, at that speed the G-forces would be catastrophic. 6 Gs? Maybe 7. Enough to drain blood from his brain, collapse his vision to a pinpoint, maybe knock him unconscious. If he blacked out, he'd keep diving. Straight into the sand at terminal velocity. He'd seen crash sites like that. There's nothing left to bury. The Merlin engine coughed to life, then caught with a roar. The propeller blurred into invisibility. John fastened his oxygen mask, adjusted his goggles. In the mirror mounted above the instrument panel, he caught his own reflection, hollow-eyed, unshaven, 26 years old, but looking 40. Squadron leader Harris's voice came through the radio. "Freeman, you're cleared for takeoff. Target bearing 270, distance 18 miles. German column is moving at 10 kilometers per hour, heading east-northeast. They'll reach our lines in 40 minutes. Understood." John's voice sounded strange to himself. Calm, detached, as if someone else was speaking. "John." Harris dropped the formality. "You don't have to do this." "Yes, sir, I do." "Why?" John thought about the boy with no legs, about the faces in the trenches, about his mother's piano and his father's wrenches, and the village where nothing much happened except the changing of seasons, about a world where people kept promises. "Because someone has to," he said. He released the brakes. The Hurricane rolled forward, picking up speed, 30 knots, 40, 50. The tail lifted, the wheels left the earth. And John Freeman climbed into the morning sky alone. At 8,000 feet, he leveled off and scanned the horizon. The desert stretched infinite and golden, rippled with dunes that cast long shadows in the early light. Somewhere down there, 23 German tanks were moving toward men who had no defense against them. John pushed the throttle forward and turned toward the coordinates. The flight took 9 minutes. 9 minutes where he went over the plan again and again. Approach from the sun, make them blind. Climb to 12,000 feet for maximum dive speed. Pick the lead tank, kill the commander. Vertical dive, release rockets at 800 feet, pull out at 400. 400 feet. At that altitude, if anything went wrong, if the controls jammed, if the engine stalled, if he misjudged by even a second, he'd have no chance. Then he saw them. Dust plume first, rising in a brown column against the blue sky. Then the glint of metal. Tank after tank after tank, moving in a staggered line formation with half-tracks and armoured cars between them. The German column stretched nearly a mile. John's mouth went dry. His hands tightened on the control stick. This was it. The moment. The point where you either commit or turn back. Where you either become a hero or a memory, or both. He thought about his instructor at Cranwell, a grizzled veteran of the First World War, who'd once told him, "Flying is easy, son. It's the deciding to jump that's hard." John Freeman pushed the throttle to maximum and climbed toward the Sunday, 12,000 feet. The air thin and cold. the desert a mosaic far below, his breathing loud inside the oxygen mask, his heart beat a drum in his ears. He rolled the hurricane inverted, the world flipped. Sky became ground, ground became sky. And he pushed the stick forward. The dive was a scream of physics and madness. John plummeted straight down, nose vertical, the Merlin engine howling at full throttle. The altimeter unwound like a stopwatch 11,000 feet, 10,000, 9,000. The hurricane shuddered, protesting forces it wasn't designed for. The wings flexed, rivets groaned. 400 miles per hour. 420. 450. Through the gun sight, the German column grew from toy models to full size in seconds. He could see individual tanks now, Panzer IVs with their long guns and Panzer IIIs with their shorter barrels. He could see the crews scrambling out of hatches, pointing up, shouting. He could see the flat gun swiveling. Tracers streaked past red lines of 20mm rounds searching for him. But he was too fast, too vertical. The gunners couldn't compensate. They'd been trained to hit aircraft flying level, not aircraft falling like meteors. 6,000 feet. 5,000? John's vision tunneled. His G-suit squeezed his legs, trying to keep blood in his brain. His hands, slick with sweat, gripped the stick so tight his knuckles went white. 3,000 feet. He centered the gun sight on the lead panzer, a command tank with extra antennas. The commander was still standing in the turret hatch, frozen, staring straight up at death diving toward him. 2,000 feet. John's thumb hovered over the rocket release. Not yet. Not yet. 1,500 feet. The panzer filled his entire vision. He could see the camouflage pattern, the spare tracks welded to the hull for extra armor, the black cross painted on the turret. 1,000 feet. Now, he pressed the release. 8 rockets ignited simultaneously, detaching from the wings with a jolt. 8 trails of white smoke lanced downward. 8 60-pound warheads reaching terminal velocity, augmented by gravity and the hurricane's dive speed. 800 feet. The rockets impacted. The lead panzer exploded not a Hollywood fireball, but a brutal eruption of flame and shrapnel and torn metal. The turret ripped free, sailing 20 feet before crashing into the sand. Secondary explosions as ammunition cooked off, fuel tanks ruptured, flames spread. But John didn't see it. Because at 800 feet, diving at 470 miles per hour, he had exactly one thought: pull. He hauled back on the stick with both hands. Every muscle in his body strained. The hurricane's nose began to rise 10 degrees, 20, 30. The G-forces slammed into him like a collapsing building. 6 Gs, 7. His vision went grey at the edges. 400 feet. His vision collapsed to a tunnel. 8 Gs. 300 feet. Complete blackout. The world went dark. He couldn't see, couldn't think. Just held the stick back by pure instinct, pure muscle memory. 200 feet. The hurricane leveled out 150 feet above the desert, still doing 380 miles per hour. John's vision snapped back, light, color, the ground screaming past beneath him. He was alive. He was flying. And behind him, one panzer was burning. 22 to go. He banked hard, pulling into a steep climbing turn. His rockets were gone, but he still had his 4 20mm Hispano cannons with 364 rounds total. Not enough to destroy a tank from the front or side. But from above, through the thinner top armor? Maybe. He climbed back to 10,000 feet. The German column had stopped, tanks turning in confused circles, smoke from the destroyed panzer rising in a black pillar. Their flak guns tracked the sky but couldn't find him. John positioned himself sun behind him again, inverted the hurricane, pushed forward. The second dive was faster because fear wasn't slowing him down anymore. Fear had been replaced by something else, a cold, crystalline focus where every calculation was automatic, every movement precise. He dove, centered the gun sight, pulled the trigger. The 4 cannons roared, pumping 20mm high-explosive rounds downward at 650 rounds per minute. Tracers formed a laser-straight line from his wings to a Panzer III. The rounds, small individually but concentrated, punched through the tank's top deck, through the engine compartment, through fuel lines. John pulled out at 200 feet, vision greying but not blacking. 2 down. Again. Climb, invert, dive, fire, pull out. 3 down. Again. Dive, fire, pull out. 4 down. The Germans were in chaos now. Tanks scattering, fleeing, smashing into each other. Half-tracks racing away across the desert. The flak guns firing wildly at nothing. But 137mm gun finally found its range. John saw the muzzle flash, felt the impact a hammer blow to his left wing. Metal tore. Hydraulic fluid sprayed red mist across his canopy. The Hurricane lurched, trying to roll left. John fought the controls, compensated, still airborne, still flying. Again. Dive, fire, pull out. 5 down, 6, 7. His ammunition counter clicked towards 0. 200 rounds left. 150. 100. Each dive was agony now. Each pull-out felt like his spine would snap, his heart would burst, his brain would hemorrhage. His G-suit was soaked with sweat. His oxygen mask filled with the copper taste of blood. He'd bitten his tongue. But he kept diving. 8, 9, 10. A 20mm round punched through his tail section. The Hurricane yawed violently. The rudder controls went sloppy, cables severed. John used the ailerons to compensate, flying with wing surfaces alone. 11, 12, 13. His ammunition counter hit 0. All 4 cannons silent. But he still had mass, momentum, and gravity. John dove again, but this time he didn't fire. He couldn't. Instead, he pulled out at the last possible moment 50 feet and flew straight through the German column at 400 miles per hour. The shockwave from his passage, the supersonic crack of displaced air, flipped a half-track onto its side. The psychological effect was devastating. The remaining German crews abandoned their tanks, running into the desert on foot. Tank commanders radioed retreat orders. The entire column broke. 14, 15, 16, 17, 18, 19, 20, 21, 22, 23. 11 minutes after the first dive, Captain John Freeman pulled his shattered Hurricane into a climb and turned east toward home. Behind him, 23 German tanks were destroyed or abandoned, burning, smoking, or simply left to bake in the desert sun by crews who'd had enough. The British infantry, watching from their trenches 4 miles away, stood and cheered. They didn't know who the pilot was. They didn't know his name. But they knew they'd just witnessed something impossible. John barely made it back to RAF Gambut. The Hurricane was dying. The left wing leaked hydraulic fluid in a red stream. The tail section flapped loose, held by 3 cables. The engine temperature gauge pinned at 140 degrees, 20 degrees beyond redline. Black smoke trailed from the cowling. He flew the last 8 miles at 200 feet, too low for a safe bailout but high enough to clear the dunes. Every few seconds, the engine coughed, missing cylinders. The control stick vibrated like a living thing trying to escape his grip. At 0721 hours, he crossed the perimeter of RAF Gambut. The airstrip, that precious stretch of packed sand, had never looked so beautiful. But he had no hydraulics, no flaps, no way to slow down gently. John keyed the radio. Gambut Tower, Hurricane 2, 7 requesting emergency landing, no flaps, minimal control, engine failing. The tower, 2-7, you're cleared for immediate landing, fire trucks are rolling. He lined up on the runway. Too fast, 180 miles per hour instead of the normal 80. The Hurricane hit hard, bounced, hit again. The landing gear, miraculously still intact, dug into the sand. The tail wheel collapsed. The aircraft slewed sideways, throwing up a wall of dust. Metal screamed. Something snapped. The Hurricane ground to a stop 300 yards down the runway, nose pointed at the sky, tail dragging in the dirt. Silence. John sat in the cockpit, hands still gripping the stick, and realized he was shaking. Not from fear that would come later, from adrenaline crash, from exhaustion, from the simple fact that he was alive. The canopy wrenched open. McLeod, the crew chief, stood on the wing looking at him with wide eyes. "Sir? Sir? Can you hear me?" John fumbled with his harness. His fingers wouldn't work right. McLeod helped him, unclipping the straps. John tried to stand, but his legs buckled. 2 ground crew caught him, lowered him to the sand. Squadron leader Harris ran up, breathing hard. "Freeman? John? Talk to me." John pulled off his oxygen mask. "Spat blood. Target. Destroyed, sir." "How many?" "All of them." Harris stared at him. "All of them? All 23 tanks?" 23 confirmed. John's voice was hoarse. "Column scattered. Threat neutralized." For a moment, Harris just stood there. Then he started laughing, the kind of laughter that's half relief, half disbelief. "You absolute madman! You actually did it!" The medical officer pushed through, crouched beside John. "Let me see him. Captain, can you follow my finger?" He shone a light in John's eyes. Checked his pulse. "Tachycardia, possible G-lock exposure, but responsive. You're bloody lucky you didn't stroke out." John looked at the Hurricane, counted the holes in the fuselage 17 that he could see. The left wing's skin peeled back like a sardine can, the tail barely attached. That this aircraft had flown at all, let alone survived 11 consecutive vertical dives, was a miracle of engineering and stubbornness. "Mac," John said, "how's my Hurricane?" McLeod walked around the wreck, shaking his head. "She's done, sir. Even if we could fix her, she'd never be airworthy again." He ran a hand along the scarred fuselage. "But she got you home. That's all that matters." The debriefing lasted 4 hours. John sat in the operations tent with Harris, the wing commander, and an intelligence officer who wrote everything down in a leather notebook. They went through every detail: altitudes, speeds, angles of attack, results. They asked him to repeat himself 3 times because what he was describing violated every doctrine in the RAF manual. "You're telling me," the wing commander said slowly, "that you executed 11 vertical dives from 10,000 feet, pulling out below 200 feet each time, while under anti-aircraft fire?" "Yes, sir." "And you survived?" "Obviously, sir." The wing commander looked at Harris. "Is he always this insubordinate?" "Only when he's right, sir." They showed John the reconnaissance photos taken by a Spitfire that had flown over the battlefield an hour after his attack. The photos showed everything: burning tanks, abandoned vehicles, German troops fleeing on foot. The intelligence officer pointed to each destroyed panzer, counting 23 confirmed kills. "This is unprecedented," the intelligence officer said. "The highest single sortie tank destruction on record is 8. You more than doubled it." John stared at the photos. Each black smudge was a tank. Each tank had a crew 4 or 5 men. Young men, probably, with families, with mothers who played piano, or fathers who fixed trains. Herr Feld, sick. "Are you all right?" Harris asked. "Fine, sir." But he wasn't. The next morning, John was summoned to the tent of General Bernard Montgomery himself, commander of the 8th Army, architect of the Alamein offensive. Montgomery was a small, sharp-eyed man who radiated intensity like a furnace. He stood over a map table covered with unit markers and looked up when John entered. "Captain Freeman, the pilot who thinks he's a Stuka." John saluted. "Sir?" "At ease." Montgomery gestured to the map. "Your attack yesterday prevented a breakthrough here." He tapped a spot. "This infantry brigade, 2,000 men would have been overrun. Instead, the German column broke and retreated. Rommel's entire southern flank collapsed. Do you understand what that means?" "No, sir." "It means we won. The Battle of El Alamein, the turning point of the North African campaign. And you, Captain, delivered the decisive blow." Montgomery studied him. "How does that feel?" John thought about the boy with no legs, about the burning panzers, about the German crews who died because he'd been good at trigonometry and desperate enough to try. "I don't know, sir." Montgomery nodded. "Honest answer, I respect that." He picked up a small leather case from the table. His Majesty's government respects it too. Captain John Freeman, for extraordinary heroism and exceptional flying skill in the face of overwhelming odds, I am authorized to award you the Distinguished Service Order. He opened the case. Inside, a silver cross on a red and blue ribbon. John stared at it. Another medal. Another piece of metal to pin on his chest and remember who died. "Sir," he said quietly, "I don't deserve this." "No one who deserves it thinks they do," Montgomery said. "That's how I know you've earned it." He pinned the DSO to John's tunic, next to his DFC. "Wear it, and know that those 2,000 men who didn't die yesterday, they'll go home to their families because of you." But not everyone saw John as a hero. The controversy started 3 days later when a report reached London. The Air Ministry, the bureaucratic heart of the RAF, read the combat reports and was horrified. Vertical dive bombing in a hurricane? 11 consecutive dives? Pullouts below 200 feet? Air Vice Marshal Critchley, head of fighter operations, threw the report on his desk. "This is suicide tactics. If this becomes standard doctrine, we'll lose every pilot we have." A board of inquiry was convened. John was ordered to appear before a panel of senior officers in Cairo. The questions were hostile. "Did you receive authorization for this attack profile?" "No, sir." "Are you aware that RAF regulations prohibit dive angles exceeding 60 degrees?" "Yes, sir." "Do you consider yourself exempt from regulations?" "No, sir. I considered 23 panzers a greater threat than regulations." The room went silent. Finally, Air Commodore Fellows, a veteran of the First World War, leaned forward. "Captain Freeman, what you did was reckless, dangerous, and violated every safety protocol we have. It should have killed you." He paused. "Why didn't it?" John thought carefully. "Because I was willing to die, sir, and because the Germans weren't expecting someone crazy enough to try." "Is that your tactical assessment?" "Yes, sir." Fellows glanced at his fellow officers. "Gentlemen, I propose we do 2 things. First, we award Captain Freeman a medal for what he accomplished. Second, we make it absolutely clear that no one is ever to attempt this tactic again. Because the only reason it worked is that it was unthinkable. The moment it becomes standard doctrine, the Germans will adapt and it will become a death sentence." The other officers nodded. John was dismissed with a commendation and a warning, "Never do this again." But what no one in that room understood, what John barely understood himself, was that his 11-minute attack had already changed warfare forever. The story of Freeman's dive, as it came to be called, spread through the RAF like wildfire. Pilots who'd heard the tale third hand would argue about the details in mess halls. Was it 11 dives or 12? Did he pull out at 200 feet or 150? How many holes did his Hurricane have, 17 or 27? The numbers changed with each retelling, growing mythic. But the core remained true. 1 pilot, 1 aircraft, 23 tanks, 11 minutes. Within weeks, the combat report reached the United States Army Air Forces. American pilots, training for their own ground attack missions, studied John's tactics with fascination and horror. General Henry Hap Arnold, commanding general of the USAAF, read the report and scrawled in the margin, "Effective but not repeatable. Requires pilot with death wish." The Soviet Air Force heard about it through intelligence channels. Soviet pilots, already famous for ramming attacks and suicidal courage, tried to replicate Freeman's dives in their Sturmovix. 43 pilots attempted vertical dive-bombing attacks on German armour in the winter of 1942–43. 31 died. The tactic was officially banned by the Soviet High Command. But the Germans noticed too. Rommel himself, in his personal diary dated November 4th, 1942, wrote, "We are facing a new type of air attack, near vertical dives at speeds approaching terminal velocity. Our flak doctrine is ineffective. If this becomes widespread, our armoured operations will become impossible." German engineers scrambled to adapt. New anti-aircraft gun sights were developed, designed to track high-angle diving aircraft. Faster traverse mechanisms. Radar guidance. By 1943, the Germans had created systems specifically to counter Freeman-style attacks, which meant, paradoxically, that John's tactic had become obsolete the moment it succeeded. The element of surprise, the fact that it was unthinkable, had been its greatest weapon. Once the enemy expected it, the 6% survival rate plummeted to 0. But Freeman's real legacy wasn't tactical. It was psychological. In December 1942, the RAF released a recruitment film called Into the Dive. It dramatized John's attack, with some Hollywood embellishments. The narrator intoned, "When the odds are impossible, when regulations say it can't be done, remember Captain Freeman. Remember that courage is not the absence of fear, it's flying through it." The film was shown in cinemas across Britain. Young men, watching that hurricane dive through fire and smoke, made the decision to join up. Recruitment spiked 22% in the first quarter of 1943. John hated the film. He walked out of the premiere screening after 10 minutes. The actor playing him, a handsome type with perfect teeth, looked nothing like the exhausted, terrified man who'd actually flown that mission. The dialogue was melodramatic. The music was manipulative, and worst of all, it made dying look glorious. "It's propaganda," John told Harris bitterly. "They're using my face to send boys to their deaths." "Maybe," Harris said. "Or maybe you're giving those boys hope that even impossible missions can succeed. You can't choose how your story is used, John, only whether you told it." In the years after the war, military historians began dissecting Freeman's attack with academic precision. A 1956 study by the Royal Air Force Historical Branch analysed the physics of his dives. The conclusion: based on the hurricane's structural specifications, there was a 73% probability of wing failure during a dive exceeding 460 miles per hour at angles greater than 80 degrees. John had performed 11 suicidal. The statistical likelihood of surviving all 11 was less than 0.3%. Captain Freeman, the study concluded, should be dead. That he is not represents either extraordinary luck or skill beyond quantification, likely both. A 1961 book titled Knights of the Air, RAF Heroes of World War II included a chapter on John. The author interviewed him at length. When asked how he'd survived, John's answer was simple. "I don't know. The hurricane held together. I stayed conscious. And God apparently had other plans." But the most significant analysis came in 1968 from an unexpected source, the United States Navy. The Navy was developing a new ground attack aircraft, the A-7 Corsair II. Engineers struggled with the same problem John had faced: how to deliver ordnance accurately against armoured targets, while minimising exposure to anti-aircraft fire. Someone in the design team mentioned Freeman's dive. The Navy invited John, by then a retired wing commander living in Kent, to consult on the project. He spent 2 weeks at NAS Patuxent River explaining his attack profile to engineers and test pilots. "The key," John told them, "is not the dive angle. It's the commitment. If you hesitate, if you pull out early, you miss the target and waste the sortie. You have to be willing to ride it all the way down, except that you might die. Only then does your brain calculate correctly." The lead engineer, a man named Robert Whitcomb, asked, "How do you teach that? How do you train someone to accept death?" John looked at him for a long moment. "You don't. You just hope you never have to." The A-7 Corsair II incorporated lessons from Freeman's dive, reinforced airframes for high-G pullouts, improved dive brakes, and targeting computers that calculated release points automatically. The aircraft served with distinction in Vietnam and beyond. John Freeman, the pilot who'd flown by instinct and desperation in 1942, had inadvertently influenced aerospace engineering for decades. But perhaps his deepest legacy was personal. After the war, John received hundreds of letters from men who'd been in the trenches that day, the 2,000 soldiers of the infantry brigade that his attack had saved. They wrote to thank him, to tell him about their lives, jobs, marriages, children, to say that they existed because he'd dived. One letter from a corporal named Thomas Henley stood out. "Sir, I was in the front trench when your hurricane appeared. We thought you'd gone mad. We watched you dive and thought you'd crashed. Then the first tank exploded. Then another. Then another. We couldn't believe it. After you left, our sergeant, a man who never cried, had tears running down his face. He said, 'Boys, we just watched a man fight death and win. I went home, married my sweetheart. We have 3 children now. My oldest son, I named him John, after you. I wanted him to know that somewhere in the world there are people who would do the impossible for strangers. Thank you for my life.'" John kept that letter in his desk drawer for the rest of his days. The war ended in May 1945. John Freeman flew his last combat mission on April 28th, a patrol over northern Germany, uneventful, almost boring. When he landed back at RAF Celle and shut down the engine, he sat in the cockpit for 10 minutes, just listening to the silence. 3 years, 847 combat sorties, 19 confirmed kills, 2 distinguished flying crosses, 1 distinguished service order, and somehow, impossibly, he was still alive. He was 29 years old. He felt 60. Demobilization came quickly. By July, Wing Commander John Freeman, DSO, DFC and BAR, was a civilian again. He returned to Ashford, Kent, the village where nothing much happened, and found it exactly as he'd left it. Stone cottages, sheep farms. His mother's piano, his father's workshop. His parents had aged. His father's hands shook now from arthritis. His mother's hair had gone white. They embraced him on the station platform and didn't ask about the war. They knew better. His brother William had survived as an engineer with the Royal Engineers. His sister Margaret had worked as a codebreaker at Bletchley Park. The Freeman family had been lucky. So many families hadn't. John tried to settle into normal life. He took a job at the village school teaching mathematics and physics. The students called him Mr. Freeman and had no idea that the quiet man explaining trigonometry had once calculated dive angles while plummeting toward tanks at 460 miles per hour. He married in 1947 a woman named Elizabeth, a nurse who'd served in North Africa and understood silence. They bought a small house on the edge of the village. No children. Elizabeth said they talked about it, but John was afraid. Afraid of bringing life into a world he'd seen at its worst. At night, he still had the dreams. Falling. Burning. The Panzer commander staring up at him in the second before impact. John would wake gasping, his sheets soaked with sweat, Elizabeth's hand on his shoulder saying, "It's all right, you're home." But part of him wasn't home. Part of him was still in that hurricane cockpit, diving through fire. In 1956, the RAF invited John to a reunion dinner honouring El Alamein veterans. He almost declined. Facing the ghosts was never easy, but he went. The dinner was at a London hotel. Medals and grey hair and men who'd once been boys. John recognised some faces. Others were strangers. Many were missing the dead, the ones who hadn't made it home. Squadron leader Harris was there, now an Air Vice Marshal. He spotted John across the room and navigated through the crowd. "John Freeman, you're looking well." "So are you, sir." "Don't sir me, we're both civilians now." Harris studied him. "Do you ever think about that day, the dive?" "Every day." "Regret it?" John thought carefully. "I regret that it was necessary. I don't regret doing it." Harris nodded. "That's the answer of a man who understands war. It's all necessary and all regrettable." He raised his glass. "To the ones who didn't come home." John raised his glass. "To the ones who didn't come home." In 1968, a historian tracked John down to ask about Freeman's dive for a book. John agreed to one interview with conditions: no glorification, no propaganda, just the truth. They sat in John's study, surrounded by bookshelves and his mother's old piano. He'd inherited it when she passed. The historian, a young man named David Mitchell, set up a tape recorder. "Mr. Freeman," Mitchell began, "you're a legend. You know that, right? Pilots still study what you did." "I was desperate," John said. "Desperate people do desperate things." "But it worked. Against all odds, you survived and won." I survived, John corrected. Winning? I don't know. We defeated Germany, but at what cost? 50 million dead, cities destroyed. A generation traumatized. He looked out the window at the peaceful Kent countryside. Sometimes I think the war didn't end in 1945. It just stopped shooting. Mitchell leaned forward. If you could go back knowing what you know now, would you still make that dive? John didn't hesitate. Yes. Why? Because 2,000 men were going to die, and I had the skill and the aircraft to stop it. Once you see that equation, you can't unsee it. You have to act. He paused. But I hope that no one is ever in a position where they have to make that choice again. John Freeman died on March 15th, 1989 at the age of 73. The funeral was small, attended by family, a few surviving RAF veterans, and unexpectedly a delegation from the British Army descendants of the men whose lives he'd saved. Thomas Henley's son, the one named John, gave a eulogy. I never met Wing Commander Freeman, but I exist because of him. My father exists because of him. My children, his grandchildren, exist because of him. He dove into hell so that strangers could live. That's not just courage, that's love. Love for humanity. Love for people he'd never meet. On behalf of everyone who carries his legacy in our blood, thank you. John was buried in Ashford Churchyard, beneath an oak tree. His headstone is simple. John Freeman. 1916到1989 Wing Commander, RAF, have lived through fire, so others could live. But his story didn't end there. In 2003, a hurricane restoration project in the UK discovered the wreckage of Hurricane 27 John's aircraft from that day in a scrapyard outside Cairo. Against all odds, someone had saved it, shipped it to Egypt after the war, and forgotten about it. The restoration took 12 years. Engineers painstakingly rebuilt the airframe, repaired the bullet holes, replaced the shattered components. They found inside the cockpit a small photograph tucked behind the instrument panel, John's family, standing outside their home in Kent. He'd carried them with him every mission. In 2015, Hurricane 27 flew again. The BBC filmed it for a documentary. The pilot, an RAF test pilot named Sarah Mitchell, flew the same route John had flown 73 years earlier. She didn't dive. She couldn't. The hurricane was too precious, too historic. But she flew over the desert where 23 tanks had burned, and over the radio she said, "This is Hurricane 27, still flying, still remembering, still honouring the man who taught us that impossible is just a word." John Freeman's story is one of thousands from World War II stories of ordinary people thrust into extraordinary circumstances. What makes his unique isn't just what he did, but why. He didn't dive because he was fearless, he dove because he was terrified and did it anyway. He didn't become a hero because he wanted glory, he became a hero because the alternative watching men die when he had the power to help was unthinkable. In a world that often celebrates aggression and conquest, John Freeman reminds us that true courage is about protection, about sacrifice, about being willing to face impossible odds not for yourself, but for others. His legacy lives on not just in aircraft design or military tactics, but in every person who chooses to act when it would be easier to look away. In every moment when someone says, "This is unthinkable," and someone else says, "Then watch me think it." We are all, in our own ways, diving toward our own impossible challenges. We all face moments when the odds are 6% and the safer option is to turn back. John Freeman's life teaches us that sometimes the only way out is through, straight down, at terminal velocity, with everything you have, and maybe, just maybe, you'll pull out at the last second and discover you had more strength than you knew. If you've stayed with us through this entire story, thank you. History isn't just dates and battles, it's people. Real people who laughed and cried and feared and hoped, just like us. This is WWII Unthinkable, where we tell the stories that defy belief because they're true. If you want to hear more stories like John Freeman's stories of impossible odds and unthinkable courage, hit that subscribe button. Every week, we bring you another piece of history that shouldn't have happened but did. Leave a comment. What would you have done in John Freeman's position? Would you have dived? And remember, courage isn't the absence of fear. It's doing what's right even when you're terrified. Next week, the story of a German U-boat commander who broke orders to save enemy sailors and changed naval warfare forever. Until then, keep questioning, keep learning, and never stop believing that one person can change history. Because they can. They do. They did.